Hosea 7 through 10. I mentioned a few videos back that in talking about the end of the northern kingdom, it was not the sin of Adam or Eve or even Eden in general that God was upset about, but of course the sins of the people that are in the story. I'm reminded of this in our reading even today. This is Hosea 8, verses 11 to 13. Because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, they have become for God altars for sinning. I have written for him the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing. For the sacrifices of my offerings they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. 9, verses 9 and 10. They, Israel, are deeply corrupted, as in the days of Gibeah. That's probably a reference to the hometown of Saul. God will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first fruits of the fig tree in its first season. But they went to Baal Peor, that's a deity, and separated themselves to that shame. They became an abomination like the thing they loved. It's the idea of you become like the God that you worship. Well, of course, what's the solution? Hosea 10, verse 12. Sow for yourselves tzedekah, or propriety, or righteousness. Reap in mercy. In other words, do what's right, and God will repay you in patient love. Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, seek Yahweh, till he comes and rains righteousness on you. So, if that's the story of the Old Testament, encapsulated in verses like this in Hosea, how did we come to miss it, shall we say? And it's valuable sometimes to explain what you don't believe when you're trying to teach something, and I think this would be one place to do it, only because it is so prevalent. It's just part of the Western tradition of Christianity that we've all grown up with, that I'd like to take this video and describe what I don't believe when it comes to the story of the Old Testament, just to explain it here and probably grab your attention with some things that you thought were part of the story because you've grown up with it, and yet it's very different from the story we just read in Hosea. And I do this for comparison purposes, again, just to be very clear. Here is the story that we've often heard. When Adam sinned, you inherited, this is us, you inherited his guilt. So you'll hear words like headship. He was your head in terms of his lineage. Representation. He was your representative. Words like imputation. Inherited guilt, or more even common, original sin. Now, these are all words that are not in the text, and people who teach this would say, true, they're not in the text, but they're given to us as a theological idea. Romans 5, verses 12 to 19, is the only place that this idea of Adam's sin being inherited by us is ever taught. But the idea of this view is that Paul, in AD 52, is explaining for the first time, really in human history, what happened in the sin of Adam as it was being given to us. And of course the point is that it's for this reason and this reason alone that God is angry with you and I. It's this inherited guilt that God cannot forgive. Again, in this view, God is not able to forgive it because of his justice. He demands some kind of retributive payment, and he doesn't have it, of course, until, and here comes of course, the solution to this story in this version, and that would be the person of Jesus. And what happens again here would be that Jesus' moral, behavioral perfection is appreciated or honored by God, and then that behavioral perfection is attributed to you and I. And again, words like headship of Jesus, representation, imputation, those words are duplicated over here. And thus the story is that the solution to the problem is substituted moral perfection. All right. So, in fact, here is a quotation from a standard theology book that I grew up on, that I taught, that I used when I taught. and it's still used in seminaries today. Because of Adam's sin, all persons receive a corrupted nature and are guilty in God's sight as well. We were all present in the person of Adam, who along with Eve was the entire human race. Thus it was not merely Adam, but humanity that sinned. We were involved, though not personally, and are responsible for this sin. Well, in sum, again, this is what I don't believe, and I'm only doing this today just to be clear about the opposite view of what I think the Old Testament is teaching. This view is very complex, it's very detailed, and often the person on the street believes that this is the story, but they've never gone to seminary, but they've just learned this view almost by osmosis. My atheist friend believes this is what is taught in the Christian faith, but he's never been to church. Well, how did he learn it? He must have learned it through billboards or conversation with Christians or something like that. So this is pervasive, even though it's not explained in such detail usually. There are many presuppositions that go into this. Many parts of the story, I would recommend headship, all these words here. The idea of substitution, the idea of payment, the idea of original inherited guilt. All of these are not in the Old Testament story. They are completely missing from the story of the Old Testament, but they're put into this story kind of as a background for this story to work. And it's usually not talked about much when this story is explained, but it's all part of the story running in the background. I think the most dangerous part of this, for me anyway, is that it almost is assumed that by believing this story one becomes a Christian, as though believing a set of propositions is the means by which a person becomes a Christian. And if that's the case, we have a lot of work to do, of course, because that's very different from the Old Testament story. Well, how did we get here? How did it happen that we have what I'd recommend, what we've been doing in our Old Testament study to this point is filling out a very simple story of God wanting our worship and we giving our worship to another God. How did we substitute that story for this one? Well, I don't think it was intentional in the sense of looking at both stories and giving up on one and accepting the other. I think it was just inattention. I think at least it was for me. I hadn't thought about other gods as a reality until about 20 years ago. And so my understanding of the Old Testament has changed based on just looking for the story itself without putting in ideas that are really, I'm finding, kind of a backwards look into the Old Testament. So again, probably the biggest reason I would take this to be not the story would be the book of Hosea, even our reading today. And this simple idea that the book of Hosea and the Old Testament story, if this was true, would sound completely different.